Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining CNBC.
Thank you.
I want to kick off by asking you to directly respond to the idea that China today is the Pentagon's top concern. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is what I outlined in my speech earlier today, and that is as we look at our national defense strategy, it says that we are now in this era of great power competition. And that means we need to focus more on high-intensity warfare going forward. And our long-term challenges are China, number one, and Russia, number two. And what we see happening out there is a China that continues to grow its military strength, its economic power, its commercial activity, and it's doing so in many ways illicitly, or it's using the international rules-based order against us to continue this growth, to acquire technology, and to do the things that really undermine our nation's, I say that plural, sovereignty, that undermine the rule of law, that really question their commitment to human rights.
When we talk about what happens next within the 5G space, a lot of investors and frankly a lot of governments say to us, listen, if there was a better, cheaper alternative to Huawei, we'd be using it. But unfortunately, that just doesn't seem to be the case. What is the U.S. government planning to do to get U.S. companies there?
Well, we need to do our part not just with U.S. companies, but with European companies. There are some Asian companies, and we need to make sure that we provide an affordable, competitive alternative. But at the same time, we just can't be duped into a company that's subsidized by the Chinese government, that has close ties to the Chinese Communist Party, and allow them into our networks and compromise them, because what it will do is it will undermine our security. It will undermine our ability to exchange information and intelligence and to do all those things we need to do to guarantee the security of our countries and the security of our peoples.
How much money are you willing as the Pentagon to put behind that kind of technology?
Well, we're putting hundreds of millions of dollars behind it right now by running test beds at several of our bases where we invite commercial vendors in. We open up the community, if you will. I can put aside unnecessary regulation that inhibits the testing, and we can really help companies grow in a partnership with DoD, because it enables us too. We need to be able to access data at the speed and volume of relevance to warfighting, and if we can help commercial vendors get there, it helps us. It also helps the marketplace, the private sector.
How far are we away from that point in terms of those commercial vendors? Are there preferred companies? I mean, is there a timeline you're looking at?
Well, we need to move as quickly as we can, because otherwise China's domination of this market will continue to grow. It's a long sought-out strategy where they are undermining markets by going in with below market value prices. They're gobbling up market share, and we need to get there quickly so we can keep them out of that space and then preserve our close ties with all of our partners and allies.
When you look at this from the perspective of strategy, the coronavirus hitting China very hard. At the same time, they've even described their own approach to this as a wartime crackdown in terms of getting control of what's happening with regards to the virus. Are you worried that China's model, shall we say, of capitalism, this government-sponsored capitalism, is endangered by what we've seen over the last couple of weeks with regards to corona? Because it seems as if the Chinese government took a long time to recognize the problem.
Well, my concern is with the model writ large. It's not just their economic model, but it's the political model as well. So if you read deeply into the papers, what you find is that one of the challenges that constantly faces a lack of transparency. And why did this virus spread so quickly? I think they interviewed the mayor of Wuhan, who said, look, I was afraid to say anything because they would come down on me, maybe put me in jail.
So almost a Maoist playbook with regards to what's happening.
Well, and so what happens is, in this case, suppressing the truth, putting a heavy hand on local authorities, actually enabled the virus to spread. And if we had a different type of system where it was much more open, much more transparent, willing to admit shortcomings, willing to accept help from the outside, we could have tamped down this virus arguably much more quickly.
When you think about what's happening next in terms of the military spending, would you say then that we should be focusing less on F-35s and more on putting money behind tech companies and their research?
No, I don't think it's necessarily one against the other. The F-35 is a very capable sixth-generation aircraft we need for the high-intensity warfare that the National Defense Strategy calls for. But at the same time, we recognize going forward that so much of what we do involves the technologies of communications and artificial intelligence and robotics, all those things that are being developed in some cases at a much quicker pace in the commercial sector, in the private sector. So we need actually to partner more closely with those companies and invest in those technologies so that we can stay ahead of the game and retain overmatch. at the end of the day, we're not trying to fight anybody. We're not trying to fight China. We're trying to deter war. That's my commitment. That's my obligation.
When you look at the array of challenges facing the United States today from a defense perspective, you're talking about China, you're talking about Russia, you're diverting funds from maybe traditional programs now to the border wall. Is the threat from the southern border more significant than what we see globally?
Well, border security is Homeland Security. Homeland Security is national security. The Department of Homeland Security has asked for our support. We will do it. The DoD has done this many times in the past as well, provided support to DHS, to the border. And so when you step back and look at the big scheme of things, the immediate challenges I face, that DoD faces, are the threats from North Korea and Iran more immediately right now. And then we have to make sure that we're addressing the longer-term threats of China, principally, and then secondarily Russia. And I think we can manage all that with what we have before us. Going forward, as I've said publicly, we're going to need to sustain this advantage, and to gain the advantage and then sustain it, is to make sure we have 3 to 5% annual increases in our real spending.
So you see the threat from the southern border as equal to threats from North Korea, China, Russia?
Oh, you can't compare any of these threats like this. They're all different. They're all varied. But clearly we have an unsecure border where we have everything from persons are being trafficked, which is dangerous. We don't know whether we have criminals or maybe terrorists coming across the border. We need to have a secure border. What a hallmark of a sovereign state is the ability to control, monitor, secure its borders. And it's very important. It's been important not just to this administration, obviously, but to previous administrations as well.
Walk me through the agreement that we've seen in the last 24 hours with regards to the Taliban. What does it look like in your mind if they do what they say they're going to do? A drawdown of U.S. troops. Are we going to see U.S. troops out of Afghanistan potentially by the election? What does that look like to you?
Well, what we have on the table right now is a reduction in violence. It commits each side to a number of things that they will not do in order to lower the temperature, to lower the level of violence to significantly, I might add. And at some point, once we're finished with our consultations, I've been busy with our allies this past week, consulting with them. Many of them are with us in Afghanistan in the Resolute Support Mission, consulting with Congress as well. Everything is pointing in the right direction for us to say, yes, well, let's begin this reduction in violence period. It would be 7 days, conditions-based. If the Taliban live up to their end of the deal, if they exercise in good faith restraint, and it sets the stage for us to consider the peace agreement. And what the peace agreement would do was require both sides to do a number of things. Most significantly on our side would be begin a withdrawal down to about 8,600 forces. It's a level which we're very confident that we can continue to do all of our missions, whether it's counterterrorism or train, advise, and assist. But at the same time, importantly, it requires the Taliban and the current Afghanistan government to sit down and to begin intra-Afghan negotiations about a way forward that ends up in a final political settlement to this long-standing conflict. That's the best, if not only way forward, is to get on that peace track, on that political agreement track. We very well may be on it right now. It's important to stay on it and really let the Afghans sit down, a wide, representative, diverse body of Afghans from both the current government and the Taliban, to find a way forward based on compromise and inclusiveness and all those things that we hope for the Afghan people. Is
this what victory looks like for the United States?
Well, I'm reluctant to call things victories or losses, but I think it's the way forward. It enables us to reduce our footprint, our presence in Afghanistan going forward. I think it's most important for the Afghan people. They've been in constant warfare for decades. I think they deserve better than what they've had. But it's up to them to want it, to own it, to come together and agree on the best path forward for all Afghans, of all ethnic groups, men and women alike, to come forward and agree on the path forward of how they want to live in peace together.
Do you believe at some point there will be no U.S. troops in Afghanistan?
Well, that'll depend in many ways on the Afghan government and what they want. What I'm committed to is ensuring that Afghanistan never again becomes a safe haven for terrorists to attack our country.
And you believe an agreement with the Taliban could get you there?
It could. It's worth trying. If not, everything we do will be conditions-based. If they don't live up to their end of the deal, we can stop at any point in time, hold in place, and continue to do those counterterrorism and train and advise assist missions. But again, we have to give this political agreement a chance. It's our first, best opportunity we've had in many, many years. It's worth it. The solution here isn't through the military. The solution is through a political agreement between the parties on the ground among the Afghan people.
Walk me through what you see as the role of NATO in the Middle East, because there's been a lot of confusion about what, when we speak to NATO leaders, frankly, about what their role should be and ought to be in a world where the United States seemingly wants to get out of a lot of its former commitments there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I wouldn't say get out of commitments. I think what I've been trying to do now as I implement the National Defense Strategy is look at each of our theaters, each of our commands, and make sure that it's right-sized to the mission, that the mission is right, and that we've right-sized our resources and forces to the mission. Now, with regard to Iraq, NATO's been there for many years, NATO mission Iraq, providing that train advise mission, and have done an excellent job, several countries involved, hundreds of troops. What we're looking at now is, can they pick up more of that, the coalition mission that is broader in terms of train, advise, and assist, and do more? This week we got an agreement in principle among our many NATO allies. The Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg, has done a fantastic job. So now what we're going to do is get into the hard work of figuring what are those tasks, what can we move over to NATO, and then who is willing to offer up troops to perform those tasks. So that's a very a good step forward. It helps us continue those two important missions we are performing in Iraq right now, missions that the Iraqi government appreciates and values. One is to the enduring defeat of ISIS. All of NATO and our partners are committed to that. And secondly, train and advise, assist the Iraqi security forces so they can pick up more of that mission of defending their country specifically against ISIS.
When you hear comments from the president of Germany, which we did just 24 hours ago here at the Munich Security Conference, essentially saying that the United States with the America First policy is all about U.S. interests at the expense of allies, how difficult do you think that makes this kind of mission? Because obviously there is a great deal of disagreement between European allies today about America's interests and America's worldview.
Yeah, I think that's a false narrative. Look,
they've had 4 years to get used to America First. Do you think they're just not seeing the bigger picture,
yeah.
or?
Let me start at the core, though, of transatlantic relations. That's NATO. So I started off my career in the United States Army. I served in NATO for 3 years, lived in Italy. I served in the NATO Rapid Reaction Force. I understand the importance of NATO. It's the greatest military alliance in history. And so when you fast forward to look at what's happening today, you see that the first time in 20 plus years, the United States is deploying 20,000 troops to the continent to reassure our NATO allies to exercise our operational plans and deter bad behavior from others. I think that's a very strong statement of our commitment to NATO and our commitment to Europe. At the same time, we, year over year, increase our defense budget. We now spend 3.2% of our GDP against it. Under President Trump's leadership, he's asked our NATO partners to make the same commitment to European defense and security. At a minimum, at least live up to your Wells pledge, from the UK, made during the Obama administration, where many countries promised to commit 2% of their GDP. Over the last 3 years, we've doubled the number of countries committing to that level of spending for defense, but we still have nearly a third of NATO allies don't even have a plan to get there by 2024. That's what we need. We need to commit ourselves to NATO, but at the same time, all partners need to commit themselves to greater sharing. With regard to Iraq, the same remains true. We have over 5,000 troops in Iraq right now committed to that country. We have over 60,000, 70,000 troops in the Middle East. Just a few months ago, I deployed an additional 4,000 troops to Saudi Arabia to reassure our partners and allies. Look, we can go around the world where I can tell you where we have hundreds of thousands of troops deployed in well over 80 countries worldwide. America's commitment to this international order, to our friends and partners, is unrelenting. We will stand up for them. We will stand up for our values. And again, I just dismiss that narrative that somehow suggests we're withdrawing from the world just because we want to right-size our forces, just because we want to end some of these conflicts and get focused on the long-term strategic challenges of our day.
Walk me through how you see this sort of dispersal of forces in this sense, because we have the maximum pressure campaign. And between various offices in the U.S. government, defense, treasury, state, there's been a lot of pressure put on Lebanon's economy, putting people on the OFAC list, trying to tackle Hezbollah and their funding via Iran. That is a country in economic crisis. Can you assure the Lebanese people that the United States has their back here? Because unfortunately, it seems as if without the backing of Hezbollah, they can't seem to pass anything within their government. And there's a lot of concern that an economic crisis is engulfing that country.
Well, look, we provide significant security assistance to Lebanon. Maybe it goes unnoticed, but the problem in the Middle East is Iran. For 40 years now, since 1979, this regime has been spreading its malign behavior all throughout the Middle East, particularly especially in places like Lebanon for many, many years, in Yemen, in Africa, in Afghanistan.
But they're really very much in the crosshairs of this policy. And there is a lot of concern that the economic crisis that's hitting Lebanon is actually going to accelerate as a result of maximum pressure.
But here's the other part that you see happening in Lebanon, you see it happening in Iraq, you see it happening in Iran. People are going into the streets and are saying enough of corruption and enough of Iranian influence in our country. Let us get back to either Lebanese affairs or in Iraq, Iraqi affairs, even the Iranian people. A couple months ago, we're calling for the death of the Ayatollah and wanting to get rid of the IRGC, who has killed its own people. We need to help those peoples because those are the values that we share: respect for human rights, respect for the individual dignity, the chance to participate in a democratic process, and not be influenced by outsiders like Iran trying to export their brand of revolution and suppressing the needs and wants of the average people in many of these states.
So the folks at the IMF and the World Bank essentially have said that to help Lebanon on their way forward, they need to know that there is a commitment from the United States beyond a security commitment. Do you see that happening in this administration?
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, obviously, I'd refer you to the State Department, who is responsible for that piece of it. But again, in terms of security assistance, we've committed a lot to the Lebanese Armed Forces, and we will continue that commitment. Wherever is that spark of freedom out there where people want individual rights, those values that we share, we want to support them. And again, the biggest challenge is Iran, this malevolent regime that's been there for 4+ decades now. We can keep dealing with the symptoms of the problem, or we can deal with the problem, and the problem is Iran.
Walk me through how you see this within the historical narrative, because essentially what we've seen over successive administrations, whether we talk about George W. Bush, whether we talk about the Obama administration, or even President Trump himself, talking about a move to get America out of the region, in the sense that no more commitments to foreign wars. But what we've seen, of course, over the last year, we've seen increasing threats from Iran. We've seen the attacks on the Saudi Aramco facilities that led the president to a decisive action to bring more U.S. troops to the region. When you take a step back and look at this more broadly, whether it's protecting U.S. interests in the region or protecting oil supplies, frankly, that are going to Asian markets, do you ever see a point where the United States is going to leave the Middle East?
I don't think about in terms of complete departures, but a reduction in our presence and our force. Yes, because for that to happen, we will have enabled our partners and allies to stand up on their own, to support themselves. We would get more of our friends from Europe and elsewhere to help assist, because you're right. The United States doesn't rely on that supply of oil from the Middle East. Others do. But at the same time, we're cognizant, because it's captured in our national defense strategy, that we have to be able to deal with violent extremist organizations. And many of them are from that area. At the same time, a major line of effort for us is supporting friends and allies. And that means friends and allies, whether they're in the Middle East, whether they're in Europe, or whether they are in Asia, is supporting them.
What does that look like to you in terms of those kinds of commitments to countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, the GCC countries, for example, that seemingly are on the front line when it comes to maximum pressure in Iran? What does that look like? For example, if there were an attack on ADNOC, would we see more U.S. troops to the region to protect those facilities? Because obviously they support the UAE's economy.
Yeah, it spans a number of different areas. I'll speak to defense. I mean, it begins everything from defense cooperation to arms cells, to bring Saudi and other students, UAE, Kuwaiti, to our schools to learn our professional military. It involves the deployment of troops. It involves training and exercises together. All those things that we can do to bring them up to a level by which they can deter Iran and defend themselves again.
How far away from that point do you think that they are?
It's always a work in progress, and we've moved a long distance over the past. My first war was the Persian Gulf War. So I've been in Saudi before, and I've spent my time on the ground fighting there. But we need to keep making progress. At the end of the day, though, the key is Iran. If we didn't have Iran, the Middle East would be very different. Or I shouldn't say Iran, but if we didn't have that regime in Iran, the Middle East would be a far different place. You'd see people able to, prosperity to bloom even more, people to pursue their own rights, their own aspirations. But that's not what we have, because Iran's bad behavior is being spread all throughout that region.
When you think about what happens next with regards to all of the investment that you're putting in as the Pentagon to technology, there is currently an opportunity for Microsoft and the Pentagon to work together. There's a contract already set in place, but a U.S. judge has put a pause on that as a result of some questions raised by Amazon. Does it worry you that this is potentially politicking at the expense of national security?
Yeah, well, I'm not going to speak to too much detail because there is a lawsuit pending, but I will tell you this much. We need to get our forces into the cloud. We need to move forward on the JEDI project. It's absolutely critical to the effectiveness and efficiency of our warfighter. If we can get into the cloud with our data, with our systems, overlay artificial intelligence on top of that, our ability to act and think will be so much more, will be accelerated, quickened to the degree that we would have overmatch for years to come in terms of warfighting. And again, when you have that level of capability, it deters warfare. And also, if deterrence breaks down, we're in a far better position to fight and win a conflict.
Does this force you to look at potentially alternatives just to get this cloud computing to where you need it to be?
We're committed to the path we are on. It's important to get to the cloud. First of all, we have many of our systems are in the cloud right now. For some reason, this one keeps getting held up by challenge after challenge. But we need to get there. We need to move to the cloud quicker, if you will, and then, again, overlay that with artificial intelligence.
Mr. Secretary, thank you so much for joining us on CNBC.
Thank you.